Hello everyone and welcome to this second presentation of In Fact. Today I will talk about this topic, antibodies and psychosis. So, antibodies are large Y-shaped proteins which are recognizing and neutralizing foreign objects, such as, for example, bacteria and viruses. Psychosis is a symptom where patients have the difficulty to make the difference between what is real and what is not. In some cases, there is a relationship between antibodies and psychosis. Let's see how. So here's an example of this relationship. NMDA receptor encephalitis. So, NMDA receptor encaphilitis is a brain inflammation which is created by the immune system. NMDA receptor encaphilitis was first named in 2007. 60% of affected patients have psychosis, and when treated, 60 to 80% of patients fully recover. I will give you a more detailed definition of NMDA receptor encaphilitis first, what actually happens in the brain, what are the symptoms, what are the treatments of the disease, and I will give you then a conclusion of this topic. So, let's have a look at here. Encephalitis is an inflammation of the brain. It's a mix between encephalon, which in Greek means what is inside the head, and itis, which is a suffix of inflammation. An inflammation is a defense mechanism against an injury or a pathogen. An inflammation is often created by the immune system. The immune system is made of two major cells, T cells and B cells. So B cells are cells which are producing antibodies which have the purpose to recognize and neutralize viruses or bacteria, for example, whereas T cells have a purpose to kill infected cells which are infected by viruses, for example. NMDA receptor stands for N-methyl-D-aspartate receptor, and this protein is involved in the signal transmission between neurons. So a neuron here, so you have a dendrite, you have a cell body with a nucleus, you got the axon here, and then you got the synapse. The synapse is the place where the N-methyl-D receptor is located. It's the place where the signal between a neuron here, a neuron A here, and neuron B is transmitted. This is the place where the signal is exchanged. So, like in this animation, you got your signal going here, and then going into the cell. Let's have a deeper look at the synapse. So here you got the presynaptic neuron and you got the postsynaptic neuron, and here you got your synapse. What happens is that you're going to have a signal where it's going to actually burst these little bubbles here open. And these bubbles contain molecules called glutamate. Glutamate are actually going to be released in the synaptic cleft here, the space here, and it's going to bind to NMDA receptors. NMDA receptors are like gates. They need a key to be opened. When they're opened, they're going to actually make calcium, which appears here. Sorry, I'm going to appear here, and going to go through the cell. When entering, calcium is going to generate a signal, which will then be transmitted to another neuron, and so on. So NMDA receptor is essential for signal transmission from a neuron to another. NMDA receptor encaphalitis is what we call an autoimmune disorder. So what does that mean? Well, the immune system is involved in recognizing threats, so recognizing everything which is foreign for the body. But it happens that the immune system starts to recognize the body as a threat, and this is an issue. The NMDA receptor encaphalitis is an example of an autoimmune disorder where the antibodies, instead of targeting viruses or bacteria, start to actually target NMDA receptors. And this, what happens is that they're going to neutralize the NMDA receptors, they're going to remove NMDA receptors basically from neurons, and when a nerve cell is going to actually have a signal and release glutamate, well, glutamate will have nothing to bind to, will have no receptors to bind to, and so what happens is that there's going to be no signal transmission. And this is going to lead to a lot of issues. But first, let's see what causes this autoimmune disorder. Well, here is one explanation for which happens in women, and women having cancer, ovary cancer. In ovary cancer, there's some tumors, and in tumors you have cells, cancer cells, which are expressing an NMDA receptor. It is to be known that an NMDA receptor is not only expressed in the brain, it's also expressed in other cells in the body. What happens is that the immune system recognizes cancer cells which have an NMDA receptor. So far, no problem. The immune system will recognize with antibodies these specific cancer cells and will eliminate them, and everything is happening in order right now, so far. But what happens in certain cases is that the blood-brain barrier is a bit like Gandalf. Is making sure that nothing shall pass. No viruses, no bacteria, no antibodies, no cells, no immune cells, nothing. It's a way to protect the brain from any aggression. What happens is that in some cases the blood-brain barrier is impaired and anything can go through it, including antibodies and immune cells. And what happens is that the antibodies which were trained to recognize NMDA receptors from cancer cells are going to also recognize NMDA receptors which are naturally present on neurons, and thus reneutralizing the NMDA receptors present there. There's other explanations also as well, especially because this is not the only explanation of this disease, but all of these theories are not fully elucidated yet. They're not proven yet. One of them is that there's a molecular similarity between a foreign antigen and self-antigen. That means that a part of a virus or a bacteria is very, very similar to an NMDA receptor, and the antibody trained against this virus or bacteria is not going to make the difference between NMDA receptor or viruses, and is going to attack both, making no difference. So this will create an NMDA receptor encephalitis. So many causes remain unknown. Now let's have a look at the symptoms and diagnosis of this disease. So first of all, you begin with a flu-like symptoms, so very non-specific. So you have a fever, headache. You're tired, so flu-like symptoms. Then you have memory issues, emotional disturbances leading up to psychosis. Psychosis is one of the major symptoms in NMDAR receptor encephalitis, and this is also why a lot of actually NMDAR receptor encephalitis patients are mistakenly taken for schizophrenia patients because they share the same symptoms. However, those are not the same causes creating these two different diseases, and so not the same treatments at all. We'll see later on why. So when going on the progression of the disease, you have movement impairments, seizures, and then also breathing and temperature regulation impairments. So all of these symptoms are chronological. So it happens smoothly with flu-like symptoms and end up with breathing and temperature regulation impairment. That means that they cannot breathe by themselves and they cannot regulate the temperature by themselves, and in some cases, sadly, it could lead up to death. But of course, mostly patients can be cured from this disease. Actually, 75 to 80% can actually be saved from this disease. And let's see what are the diagnoses to such patients. So, patient history is actually quite interesting to know if they had previous infectious events before, such as herpesvirus, to see what are the symptoms. Plasma analysis, so blood analysis. Spinal cord fluid analysis. So the spinal cord fluid analysis is a fluid present from the bottom of your spinal cord to your brain, and it's a fluid which will maybe hopefully contain antibodies. So we're going to actually do these two analyses, so plasma analysis and spinal cord fluid analysis, to know if there is antibodies directed against the NMDA receptor. And finally, EEG. EEG is a technique which also called electroencephalography, where you're going to actually look at the signals from the patient's brain, the electrical signals, and it's going to give you a profile, and you're going to compare this profile to a database of patients having an NMDAR receptor encephalitis or patient having schizophrenia. It's a way to know what kind of disorder do they have. So you combine all these techniques to actually to diagnose properly the patients to know if he has NMDAR receptor encephalitis or not. So let's look at the treatments now. So the treatments that can be used are 4 kinds: immunosuppressants, plasma exchange, immunoglobulins, and finally immunotherapy. All of them have the same purpose: reduce NMDAR receptor antibodies and immune response. So the plasma exchange therapy is to remove autoantibodies. What happens is that you actually remove antibodies. So you remove the serum which is containing this, you remove the plasma which is containing these antibodies, and you're replacing your plasma with a new plasma, which having no NMDAR receptor antibodies, hopefully. Another possibility is using immunosuppressants. That way you will decrease your immune response, and if you do so, you will also potentially decrease also antibodies as well. So there's 2 possibilities. You can use cyclophosphamide or methylprednisolone, which will reduce the number of immune cells. Immunotherapy here, the emphasis is to decrease the B cells number. B cells are responsible for producing antibodies, as we saw before, and here the idea is to use rituximab, which is an anti-CD20 antibody. CD20 is present only on B lymphocytes, and when it's actually binded with rituximab, it would actually deactivate B lymphocytes, and thus it would decrease the number of antibodies against an NMDAR receptor. Immunoglobulins or antibodies are here actually taken from normal individuals, so healthy individuals, and are given to a patient which have an NMDAR receptor encephalitis. What happens is that here you can see in blue the antibodies of the patient, the antibodies in orange from the donor, from the healthy donor, will bind to the NMDAR receptor antibodies and will actually neutralize them, and so you will have no more antibodies directed against your NMDAR receptors. So these treatments are not used alone, they're all combined together. So first line immunotherapy, for example, is using methylprednisolone, intravenous immunoglobulin, and plasma exchange at the same time to guarantee the treatment of a patient. The problem with current treatments is that there is no efficacy of proof. There's been no randomized clinical trials to say if the treatments are working or not. There's no standards to determine treatment's failure success, so there's no point in which the doctors knows where to stop or where to change of therapy. Not all treatments are adapted. Some patients actually are not responding to treatments. Some patients are actually having so much side effects that actually they cannot be treated because it's impossible for them to take it. So this needs to be new therapy options to be investigated. Finally, there is an important time window when you're giving immunosuppressants or immunotherapy. You need a lot of time to have a reduction of the number of antibodies and have a reduction of the immune response. And during this window of time, which could take up to months, a lot of things can happen. And it is during this window of time that patients can actually develop after effects, which will remain for the rest of their lives, and could be quite actually an handicap in the end. So, to conclude, antibodies can cause psychosis in this example, so by attacking NMDAR receptors. It's a treatable disease compared to schizophrenia, and however, treatments and diagnosis still needs to be improved. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate, and hopefully see you in the next video. Here are my sources if you want to go further in detail, and thank you again. Cheers.